Hi, you're on the Nomadon Dreams channel. Today I'll talk about the philosophy of solitude. We'll unpack why solitude turns out to be not just a state, but an instrument of thought and moral experience. We'll talk about how seclusion affects who you become and which decisions you consider worthy. Where are you listening from now, and what time of day is it for you? Write in the comments. It's important for me to see where people pick up this topic. Take a deep breath, feel your shoulders drop, even out your breathing rhythm for at least a few seconds. I explained the philosophy of solitude as a set of ideas about how solitude shapes personality, knowledge, and morality. This philosophy conceives of solitude as a method, not merely as a fact of life. In form, it develops principles of inner honesty, offers ways to hear your own voice, and to ask yourself stringent questions. The kind of thinking it combines norms and techniques, rules for attention, criteria of sincerity, and conceptions of the limits of freedom. It operates at the level of ideas about what it means to be, how to make decisions, and how to be responsible for your desires. Its strength is sustained by the fact that many life difficulties return one to personal experience. The loss of habitual support, changing roles, the necessity of choosing under conditions of uncertainty. In this sense, solitude provides conditions for the practical testing of ideas about self-definition and responsibility. In seclusion, answers form that in the everyday web of relationships turn out vague and superficial. This allows one to focus attention on careful work with language, memory, and attention, which become instruments of thought. The essence of the approach can be presented as several connected observations. First, solitude gives space for self-knowledge, where reflection gains time and density. Second, silence becomes a condition under which the inner voice grows clearer and more distinct. Third, seclusion functions as a laboratory of thinking, where ideas are subjected to experiment, tested for resilience and viability. Fourth, the self is perceived as a project, requiring regular choices and formation through habits, rituals, and constraints. These observations form a skeleton around which practical techniques of solitude gather. I think it's important to emphasize the role of language. The word fixes experience, makes it accessible to understanding, and, at the same time, changes it. When you speak an inner truth aloud, it takes form and becomes subject to criticism. Language here acts both as a tool of alienation, separating the thinker from the immediate experience, and as a way of transforming that experience into something intelligible and repeatable. Silence helps distinguish autopilot phrases from genuine signals, and the word turns those signals into a guide to action. Attention appears as a practical technique of solitude. The ability to concentrate makes seclusion productive. A developed discipline of perception allows you to hold a pair of thoughts within view, to construct causal chains, and to distinguish desires from habitual reactions. Such technique is not a therapeutic procedure for its own sake. It is a tool for cultivating clarity and responsibility. Small rituals of attention, short notes, fixed periods of reflection, deliberate pauses, help translate experience into an understandable structure. In this philosophy, solitude is also connected to setting limits. Limits act as internal rules that order freedom. By recognizing the boundaries of one's time, attention, and resources, a person gains the ability to act with greater autonomy. Limits do not represent a renunciation of life. They create a field for more honest and meaningful choices. Such discipline frees the will from impulsive responses and helps preserve integrity in relations with others. The moral side of solitude manifests in that ethical decisions are tested outside observation. Responsibility develops in conditions where there is no external network of control and reward. The inner cord becomes active, A deed is analyzed in the light of personal principles and the consequences a person is ready to accept. This develops the habit of answering for one's desires and of separating whims from stable values. The memory of solitude plays an educative role. Memories gathered in moments of seclusion serve as a source of character. They accumulate examples of one's choices, mistakes, and endurance, from which moral fiber is formed. Periodic reflection on such memories converts situational experience into recognized rules of conduct. This process requires attention to detail and the ability to maintain sequence. Otherwise, memory remains a chaotic store of experiences. The creative side of seclusion needs a small caveat. Solitude generates productive tension in which new answers and forms are born. This tension has a disciplinary dimension. Freedom without a backbone often leads to dispersion, while structured seclusion leads to careful work with ideas. Rituals of solitude, simple and regular, support this creative process and translate a chance thought into an elaborated solution or form. Finally, solitude can be a form of political gesture of autonomy. Retreating into oneself does not always mean withdrawing from the world. Sometimes it is a way to restore one's stance in the face of pressure from roles and expectations. Such a gesture carries with it the question of power over one's life and the readiness to act from inner awareness rather than from reactive templates. This requires willingness to accept responsibility and to allow the consequences of one's decisions. These ideas make up the general framework of the philosophy of solitude. Attention, language, memory, limits, rituals, and moral tests. They serve as practical guidance for those who want to use seclusion not as an escape, but as a tool for forming themselves. This naturally leads us to the first detailed topic: solitude as a condition of self-knowledge, where reflection acquires its density and where the first principles of inner honesty are formed. Solitude serves as a condition of self-knowledge in which a dense and honest reflection on one's life arises. This state includes deliberate seclusion with the aim of examining your thoughts, desires, and actions. It is not reduced to a random distancing from people, but implies engaged work on how you understand yourself and how you build your own life. When consciousness remains without a constant external background, there appears an opportunity to turn habitual chains of thought inside out and look at them from the outside. The emptiness of external stimuli gives time to hold one problem in the field of attention long enough to uncover hidden assumptions and repeating patterns. At such moments, language becomes an instrument. An articulated thought ceases to be merely an experience and turns into material for analysis. Recording the course of thought, a simple formulation of a doubt, combing through memories. All this turns fluid experiences into stable elements of self-description. Reflection in solitude works like a research process. Attention is arranged differently. It is less inclined to shift between other people's opinions and more inclined to the constant testing of one's own motives. In this situation, the ability develops to notice contradictions within oneself, to track emotional reactions, and to separate habitual responses from genuine aspirations. Such practice requires discipline of attention and careful handling of language, because words both illuminate and distort sensations. That is why regular notes and habits of reflection become methods, not accidental techniques. The limit of this approach is visible in phenomena where solitude lacks targeted reflection. If seclusion turns into contentless detachment, if it is filled with automatic repetitions, without an attempt to make sense of them, then self-knowledge does not develop. The same is true for prolonged social isolation, accompanied by a loss of interest in inner work or an inability to gather memories into meaningful sequences. Therefore, the key criterion lies in the presence of intention and the tools of self-investigation, time, attention, and ways of recording experience. The mechanics of self-knowledge in solitude consist of simple operations. The first operation is fixation, to hold an experience and give it verbal form. The second is deconstruction, to trace its origin, to find connections with past experience or external influences. The third is integration, to incorporate discovered elements into a broader picture of life and actions. These operations require a habit of stopping and patiently holding a thought. Without such practices, a momentary sense of truth remains ephemeral and does not become part of a stable self-identification. The image of a room with warm light and a table on which notes lie helps capture the practical tone of this idea. In this room, the inner voice has space to speak and to listen to itself in response. Paper or a screen serve as a bridge between the moment of experience and the possibility of returning to it in a week or a month. This material trace makes it possible over time to see the dynamics of one's thinking, how beliefs change, when certain fears kick in, and which decisions prove stable. The reasons why solitude becomes a fertile ground for self-knowledge are connected with the overload of external demands and with the need to distinguish one's own desire from imposed expectation. The arrangement of the process consists in organizing time and means of attention, regular intervals for reflection, simple rituals of recording, accepting a limitation on the number of distracting stimuli. The consequences of such an arrangement manifest in clearer self-presentations, stable decisions, and fewer sudden breakdowns when circumstances change. This triad shows that self-knowledge is not an abstract goal, but a practical activity with measurable results. Practical techniques of solitude include simple rules for dealing with yourself. Set aside a chunk of time for silent observation of your own thoughts. Fix key insights and recurring doubts. Formulate questions that help examine motivation. Why does this matter? Where did this come from? What consequences am I willing to accept? Maintain sequence. Return to the same questions after days and months to see the stability or variability of the answers. Keeping a journal here is not for artistic form, but as a tool of scientific rigor. Entries create a database of your inner experience. The limits of the practice must be kept clearly in view. Self-knowledge through solitude requires honesty with oneself and readiness to accept the results. There are moments when the discovered truth calls for action, sometimes painful. Self-analysis conducted without readiness for responsibility remains cosmetic. Another limit is related to temporal measure. Prolonged work on oneself should be combined with a return to social life, where the conclusions reached are tested in practice. This cycle of seclusion and re-entry into relationships makes the process mature and sustainable. Tying to the thoughts of the classics helps see how ideas of self-knowledge developed in history. Michel de Montaigne left letters and notes that are themselves examples of secluded work on the self, documents of a prolonged inner conversation. Montaigne regarded the essay as a tool for exploring his soul, and his practice shows how simple honesty with oneself can become methodology. Montaigne drew attention to small habits, to repeating reactions, and to how language records changes. His example shows the applied side of the idea we are now discussing. If you want to try this strategy, set aside a short period for daily observation and recording. Let thoughts come and fix them in 3 sentences. After a week, reread and note recurring themes. This way, a map of yourself gradually forms, one you can use in making decisions and in communication. Solitude in this format becomes a laboratory where you do not just experience emotions, but turn them into comprehensible and manageable elements of your own story. The problem is that solitude is often considered only as the experience of feeling or as an opportunity to detach. Solitude is capable of performing a more demanding function. It becomes a test of honesty and responsibility when a person remains without society, but continues to live as if still observed. In such conditions, temptations arise to evade moral work, to justify actions to one's conscience, to hide weaknesses behind talk of the right to seclusion, to leave shameful habits uncorrected. This problem is deeper than a feeling of guilt. It concerns the ability to withstand a moral exam without external witnesses and to accept the consequences of one's discoveries. The criterion that allows distinguishing ethical solitude from escape rests on the notion of inner sincerity and on the behavioral demands that follow from it. Sincerity as a norm means readiness to fix one's truth and act in accordance with it. Inner honesty is measured by the ability to account for one's motives and then change practices of behavior. Immanuel Kant spoke of the autonomy of the will and that a moral action requires the will to submit to a law one acknowledges as one's own. Søren Kierkegaard emphasized that truth becomes action through a personal relation, through the choice a person makes in solitude. Michel de Montaigne reminded us that honest recording of one's weaknesses is a way to learn to govern oneself. Criteria include readiness to admit a mistake aloud or on paper, readiness to make amends and to take responsibility before those whom your actions touched. The presence of such practices shows that solitude serves ethics and not an excuse for further withdrawal from duties. The consequences of accepting solitude as ethical responsibility appear on several levels. On a personal level, character forms that is resistant to casual excuses and casual praise. A person who in solitude has built the habit of fixing motivation and actions is less likely to fall into traps of self-justification and more readily accepts decisions that require effort. On the interpersonal level, such people create trust. Their word and their actions align, and this is felt by partners, colleagues, or loved ones. On the societal level, widespread practice of ethical seclusion makes the community less vulnerable to hypocrisy and manipulation, because norms are backed by personal discipline. One person realized that he had often justified small lies, and chose publicly to admit and correct a number of financial mistakes. This step changed his relations with colleagues and made the restoration of trust possible. Such consequences show that morality practiced in solitude returns to the world and transforms relationships. Analyzing the reasons for these consequences helps see how spiritual work turns into practical politics of behavior. The reason is that seclusion removes external noise and gives the opportunity to see the gap between self-assessment and real actions. The arrangement of the process consists in the systematic form of self-illumination. Keep records, evaluate recurring motives, voice decisions and test them in situations of accountability. Friedrich Nietzsche drew attention to the necessity of honest self-evaluation and to the danger of rationalizations that a person invents to justify habits. When a system of internal checking operates regularly, consequences become predictable. Fewer unforeseen moral failures, more consistent choices, and clarity in ordinary decisions. This analysis shows how public value grows out of solitary work. The limits of this practice must be defined strictly. Solitude remains ethical only if there is readiness for consequences. If inner honesty serves self-soothing or for entrenching an old position without change, the result will be different. There are cases when sincerity remains an intellectual insight and does not translate into action. In such situations, solitude becomes self-satisfaction. Another limit is connected with the cycle of returning to society. Testing in isolation must be combined with a test in communication, with readiness to accept criticism and readiness for real reparations. The measure of time matters. Too long a retreat inward can weaken the ability to answer to others, while too superficial reflection will not reveal deep motivations. These limits emphasize that ethical solitude is not a one-off act, but a discipline with concrete conditions for its viability. What can serve as working signals of a practice that can be developed? Evaluating behavior by 3 points helps understand where to move. Consistency between word and deed, readiness for public accountability when necessary, and the ability to repair harm. If you find that thoughts and notes repeat, but there are no outward actions, that's a sign that the next stage is needed. Contact with those whom your conclusions affect. If you are ready to admit a mistake and accept its consequences, inner sincerity has become moral strength as well. These steps are simple in form, but demanding in requirement. They call for discipline of attention and courage. In practical terms, start small. Set aside a moment in solitude for the honest question of whom you have harmed and what you can do to make amends. Write down the answer and choose one action to perform within the next 7 days. Return to the note after a month and check whether changes occurred. Such a cycle of verification makes solitude a working tool of moral self-education. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his reflections, emphasized the importance of inner connection to what a person considers natural and true. This return to the roots of feeling helps endure the encounter with consequences. The ethics of solitude require courage and honesty before yourself and others. Their meaning is to make seclusion a space where obligations are formed, not merely a shelter. If you want seclusion to work for your character, watch that the words in your notebook generate actions in the world. Then seclusion will cease to be a personal refuge and become a public resource, strengthening trust and responsibility. Language and silence work together as a mechanism for forming solitude. Words set boundaries of experience. Narrative gives an event form and makes it available for examination. Silence removes background noise and opens space for those sensations that have not yet found a name. The inner voice glues impressions into a plot. The sequence of thoughts itself stops being a simple flow and becomes a story about you. This arrangement operates at the level of perception and memory, at the level of motivation, and at the level of action. When words fix experience, they perform several tasks at once. They turn the ephemeral into the testable, provide the possibility to repeat and compare, allow you to hold a dialogue with yourself over time. Thanks to language, you can notice repeating motives, identify causal links, and run doubts through a logical mesh. At the same time, silence ensures sensitivity. It makes it possible to hear subtle shades of emotion before the word simplifies them. This combination makes solitude a tool for self-knowledge and for creative work on oneself. Why this matters specifically for moral and intellectual growth. The word imposes responsibility. A spoken thought more readily becomes an obligation. An inner narrative without words remains misty and plastic. It is easier to brush aside. By voicing a motive or decision, you create an anchor point for testing actions. Immanuel Kant, in his reflections on the self-legislating act of will, pointed out that the ability to formulate a rule for oneself turns desire into a requirement. When language is combined with silence, seclusion ceases to be an escape and becomes a laboratory of the will. Imaginal thought helps to understand precisely how word and silence combine. Imagine a room where shelves are filled with cards with notes. Silence gives you time to read a card slowly, to feel its weight. The word orders the cards, links one to another, turns chaos into a system. Martin Heidegger regarded language as the disclosure of being. In solitude, the word can show what is truly important to you, and silence gives the opportunity to listen humbly to that disclosure, without closing it off with a premature judgment. Where the mechanism works, solitude becomes an instrument of freedom. It is needed in order to stop reacting to external reflections and to begin a dialogue with your own reasons. Ludwig Wittgenstein pointed out that the limits of language determine the limits of the world. And this means that by expanding the lexical map of your inner states, you expand the sphere of what you can manage. Silence disciplines hearing and attention, helping to distinguish the important from background noise. The breakdown of this mechanism manifests in several characteristic mistakes. The word can be defensive and ritualistic. It fixes convenient explanations and political justifications, turns the painful into a convenient formula. Silence can be flight and paralysis, when it does not serve listening but closes off access to the world. The cause of such breakdowns is often that language is used as a mask rather than as a tool of verification. Repeated formulas, memorized phrases and cliches replace sincere verbalization of motivations, while passive silence roots a fear of possible criticism. Analyzing the causes, structure, and consequences of this breakdown shows where the problems grow from. The cause is the need to preserve one's sense of self without the risk of change. The structure of the breakdown is the replacement of a living narrative with a template and the refusal to test words with deeds. The consequences are alienation from one's own feelings, rigidity of beliefs, and inability to act consistently. Søren Kierkegaard emphasized that truth is experienced as a relation, and if the relation is fixed in words without inner work, then genuine change does not occur. There are also limits to the technique of word and silence. Speaking too early can deprive discoveries of their freshness and turn them into declarations. Prolonged silence can dull the ability to return to the space of responsibility. Balance requires temporal boundaries and practices of verification. Record thoughts, but leave a pause to feel them. Speak them, but test them in action. Language is good as a tool when it is flexible and willing to be questioned, and harmful when it becomes ultimate reality. The practical endurance of this idea is both simple and difficult. You can put aside a journal and first write one sentence about what you feel. Then spend a day observing without formulating. And on the next day, attempt to describe what remains. Such a sequence helps to distinguish habitual words from newly born sensations and cultivates the skill of honest verbalization. It teaches you to test your speech with deeds, because a word not confirmed by action usually turns into a defensive legend. I will formulate the conclusion like this. Language shapes the boundaries of solitude. Silence gives it depth and sensitivity. When both elements work as a tool, seclusion becomes a place of insight rather than a refuge. When one of the elements breaks, solitude turns either into frozen rhetoric or into avoidance. Watch which words you carry inside and how brave the pauses between them are. And then, solitude will be not a barrier, but a space for genuine change. What does it mean to be yourself as a project? And how does solitude become a field of choice where you construct your own personality? The self as a project begins with the decision to perceive yourself not as a given, but as a process. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that existence precedes essence, and this statement means that you are initially free and bear responsibility for your actions. In solitude, freedom takes form. Ready-made roles disappear, external cues disappear, and there remains the possibility to purposefully shape habits, language, and intentions. Martin Heidegger noted that being is disclosed in authenticity, and solitude creates the conditions for that disclosure. In a room without spectators, you gain time for choices that are not characteristic of entrenched images of personality. The unfolding of this thought reveals the concrete operations you engage in when you build yourself. First, the choice of linguistic formulas. The words you apply to your own experiences set lines of behavior and provide a possibility to test yourself over time. Second, the selection of habits and practices. Regular actions consolidate character better than any declarations. Third, the limitation of zones of influence. Established boundaries reduce the scattering of attention and create space for growth. Immanuel Kant spoke of freedom of the will as the capacity to act according to a law one gives oneself. Solitude helps to formulate such a law and to calibrate it in practice. Each of these operations requires daily discipline and honest feedback, which you can organize within yourself primarily through attentive observation and subsequent action. Developing this theme leads to a description of the technology of forming personality. The first link, the project intention, a clear understanding of which traits you want to develop. Regularity matters more than declaration. The second component, testing through small decisions. Sequential small acts give energy and material for self-affirmation. The third, processing experience into a narrative. Notes, reflective entries, short formulations about why a particular choice was made. Søren Kierkegaard wrote about subjectivity as the key to life. The self-project relies on the subject being responsible for their values and committed to living according to them. The practice is built from repeatable signals of attention. You decide what to devote time to, and thereby sustain the development of desired qualities. Next, it is important to understand the role of constraints and structures. Freedom without form quickly dissipates because the will needs a support. Structure can take the form of daily rules, written commitments, rituals for beginning and ending work. These forms serve not to limit freedom, but to make it resilient. Martin Heidegger emphasized the connection between authenticity and being in the world. The self-project requires embeddedness in the world, in commitments and in practices. In solitude, you can experiment with structure, adjust it, and observe which frameworks strengthen your ability to act consistently. The next layer is the moral aspect of the project. Forming character through solitary decisions has an ethical side. Immanuel Kant derived morality from autonomy and from the category of the universalizability of the will. The project of the self includes testing your rules for general applicability and honesty. In private practice, it is important to ask yourself whether you are ready to stand publicly behind your principles. This requirement disciplines the language of intentions and links inner work with external consequences. Psychological resilience is built through the coupling of word and deed. Jean-Paul Sartre pointed out that choices create the person, and consistent choices in small matters provide material for a stable image. Here, the role of solitude is to provide space for distinct decisions free from social pressure to conform. At the same time, this requires dialogue with reality. Your steps must be tested in contact with the world, otherwise they will remain purely imaginary. For this, short cycles are useful: formulation, action, correction, recording and observation, and repetition. Such a cycle turns abstract goals into established traits of behavior. The subtle part of the self-project is connected with the language of inner motivation. The words you use to explain your choice to yourself affect how long it will be sustained. Speech about oneself can rely on causal formulations or on value-based ones. The latter more easily preserve motivation in the long run. Martin Heidegger and Søren Kierkegaard both drew attention to depth of experience as a source of meaning. In forming the self, it is important to choose a language that works long term. This requires sincerity and the ability to refuse convenient excuses. In solitude, you can test the honesty of these formulations, changing words and observing which of them generate action. The boundary of this topic requires a clear limitation. The self-project through solitude does not encompass all aspects of personality and is not a substitute for social ties and responsibility. Solitude provides space for choice and testing, but the project needs validation in external arenas and feedback from other people. If inner work does not undergo public validation, it risks remaining a private exercise without social meaning. The project also presupposes the existence of starting materials. Biography, abilities, and circumstances impose limits on possible options.
Understanding these boundaries helps keep the process practical and prevents turning the self into an abstract construction. Watch which decisions you introduce into life and how they withstand interaction with the world. And then the project will be alive and solitude, a working space for genuine transformation. Abandoning pre-assigned roles changes the fabric of your social life. It restructures expectations, makes encounters both simpler and more demanding at the same time, because in their place appears a person who answers for their words and actions. The consequences are visible in small things. Conversations become shorter and deeper, promises rarer and more precise. And in larger ones, your reputation begins to be based on what you choose to do, rather than on which mask you try on in each environment. Such a shift makes behavior predictable in a new sense. It is now predictable that you will follow your decisions, not a script dictated by a role. What makes one give up roles if habit is so convenient and familiar? The question is simple and demanding. What is the reason that in solitude masks lose their power and yield to conscious choice? The answer lies in the fact that roles rely on external signals. When those signals are removed, the support for behavioral patterns disappears, and the void arises that must either be filled again or accepted as a field for self-work. Jean-Paul Sartre suggests that we become through choice. Martin Heidegger points out that authenticity is disclosed in relation to being. Liberation from roles begins when external cues cease to regulate behavior, and then internal choice gets a chance to show itself in action. Imagine for a moment a simple scene. An old theatrical costume, neatly folded in a wardrobe, and you, quietly choosing clothes for an ordinary day. This image helps to see the mechanism of giving up roles. Removing the costume is not a single gesture, but a series of practices. Changing verbal turns, refusing automatic reactions, repeating new actions until they become habitual. Immanuel Kant spoke of freedom as the capacity to act according to a law one gives oneself. Here, the law is created through small, repeatable acts of refusal of automatism. Søren Kierkegaard raised the question of sincerity and relation to one's own existence. And in this context, giving up roles functions as a technique for reclaiming commitments to one's life. A short, practical observation. Sit quietly and mentally list 3 roles you perform automatically every day. For each, think what word or action could replace the habitual reaction. Try applying that new move once in the coming week and record the result. Such a test is simple and quick. It shows how resilient old masks are and where there is room for maneuver. The consequences of such a practical refusal appear in relationships. You will begin to make decisions based on your own scale of values, and this will change the character of requests, compromises, and expectations. Connections will become more transparent because there will be less room given to theatricality and strategic masks. People who are accustomed to the former role will encounter a different interaction dynamic and will be forced to adjust their responses. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about the mask and about how behind it often hides the will to power. Refusing roles reduces the space for manipulative games and restores simple human responsibility to conversation.
Why does this process meet resistance in society and within oneself?
The reason is that roles create predictability and security of exchanges. Social expectations establish the rules of the game, and their destruction causes disruption in the shared scheme. Nevertheless, abandoning roles does not mean breaking obligations. Martin Heidegger reminded us of being in the world, implying connection with others. A reconfigured personality stays involved in society, only now the involvement carries quality, not only form. The limitation here is the conscious maintenance of responsibility to the networks in which you live, combined with a simultaneous change in the basis for making decisions. A clarification is useful. Changing a role does not mean getting rid of duties, but re-examining the motivation by which those duties are performed. This requires discipline of language and attention to your own explanations. Jean-Paul Sartre noted that choices create the person. Therefore, it is important that the motives accompanying new decisions be understandable and honest. You can keep short notes about why you made a particular decision and return to them regularly. Such practice turns solitary work into a verifiable history of intentions. A practical anchor in your day is simple and concrete. Start with 3 small exercises. Mark time in your calendar for solitary reflection. Review the phrases you use to explain your actions to others. Introduce one new habit that confirms your choice. I do not ask for dramatic changes. I ask for consistent work on language and actions. After a week, evaluate what has changed in how others perceive you and what has changed in your internal confidence.
Rejecting roles is a process that lives in everyday decisions, and it is through them that it becomes a stable trait of character. Move cautiously, but firmly and calmly. Let the changes be noticed by you first. Record observations, compare sensations, and adjust practices. After a month, return to the list of roles you marked at the start and assess which switches have become stable. If something did not work, change the approach, but do not abandon the goal. Small steps add up into a new manner of being, and the result of it is not so much an effect at the level of behavior as a change in inner integrity. Take notes, but do not turn the process into self-flagellation. The goal is observation, not judgment. Acknowledge progress, even if it is small, and be ready to let go of the idea of perfection. Sometimes giving up roles restores lost connections. Sometimes it exposes those who were tied to your old ideas about yourself. This is painful and honest. By going through it, you clear space for more mature relationships. Over time, you will feel that dialogues have become simpler and decisions clearer. And this brings relief and pride in honesty. I will start with a simple case. A morning when you decide not to open your mail in the first 30 minutes after waking. You place your phone face down, brew tea, read a couple of pages of a book, or simply sit in silence. After a day, this morning seems like a trifle. After a week, it ceases to be an exception and becomes a marker of the day. That marker is the boundary in miniature. It cuts off external attractions during beloved hours, frees attention, and leaves space for personal choice. I have seen how such a small practice changes the tone of communication. Decisions are made more calmly. Responses to requests become measured. The urge to react urgently loses its power. From this private case, a generalization is constructed. Boundaries work like filters that shape the fabric of everyday life. They do not take away freedom, but organize it. Immanuel Kant spoke of freedom as the capacity to act according to a law one gives oneself. Small constraints are those very laws,
only on a domestic scale. They create a series of conditions in which the will can manifest and be trained. Through regular application of boundaries, a habit of choosing is formed. You develop a standard of what is considered important and what can be postponed. Such discipline of attention transforms dispersion into directed force, turning a simple situational refusal to react into a stable trait of character. Next follows an explanation of the mechanism. Modern life is full of attractions, notifications, expectations, requests. Each of these impulses shortens your point of support, the inner moment when you can hear yourself. Boundaries act as an architecture of support. They fix the space where an external voice cannot be immediately admitted. The reason for external pressure is clear. The structure of the filter is simple. Limitation by time, by place, by form of reaction. And the consequences are obvious. There arises the possibility for deep attention, for reflection before action, and, as a result, for greater autonomy. Martin Heidegger helped to see that being in the world is attained through care and limits. And here, limits perform the same role. They make being more substantial and less dissipated. The practical side of this process requires several kinds of exercises. Start with one measurable boundary in the next 2 weeks. Allocate fixed screen-free time in the morning or evening. Limit the number of meetings per day. Introduce a rule to answer emails in 2 batches instead of constant monitoring. Record the feeling after each experiment. Did concentration grow? Did anxiety decrease? Were there fewer spontaneous concessions? By keeping such notes, you form a history of your own boundaries and learn to hold them in reality, not only in intention. This discipline of boundaries has an ethical side. Limits show what you're willing to be responsible for and where your zone of responsibility ends. Friedrich Nietzsche reflected on self-limitation as a way of strengthening the will. Here, limitation is not an end in itself, but a means to strengthen what you care about. By limiting time spent fulfilling others' demands, you preserve resources for the things that really matter to your life project. At the same time, boundaries communicate to others your priorities. People learn to wait, to ask differently, or to agree to your conditions of cooperation. Caution is needed. Boundaries are easily mistaken for a defensive wall and for closing off. Sometimes the rule, "do not be distracted," becomes an excuse to avoid difficult conversations or helping those nearby. Therefore, limitation itself requires rethinking and revision. The system of boundaries must have a mechanism for review. Schedule regular checks. Once a month, evaluate whether current limits work and what effects they bring in relationships and productivity. If a boundary has begun to serve only to avoid responsibility or to create an illusion of control, its format or timing should be changed. Another edge of limitation concerns the social context. You have obligations to a team, to family, to projects that require flexibility. Rigidly fixed boundaries sometimes break these ties if introduced without discussion and without respect for others' needs. Therefore, boundaries win when they are formalized as agreements rather than as one-sided prohibitions. In conversations with others, explain why a particular limit is important to you. This does not diminish autonomy. It makes it understandable and sustainable within relational networks. Limits have another danger. They create the illusion of integrity when inner emptiness is masked by organization of time. Soren Kierkegaard wrote about authenticity as the demand to look at one's own soul. If boundaries serve only to avoid looking, then this is not discipline, but escape. Including questions about motivation in your practice and emotionally. Including questions about listening and escape. Including questions about both in the beds and distinguish. Including questions about with any practice. Including questions about one's emptiness but escape. Including questions but others' every business. Including questions about practice and important. Including questions but others' every business. Including questions about one's known and fictably bon. 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 Therefore, boundaries win when they are formalized as agreements rather than as one-sided prohibitions. Soren Kierkegaard in your practice. Why did I set this limit? What need lies behind it? Does it align with my deeper goals? Such reflective control prevents boundaries from turning into a sham order. Limits are effective when they are flexible and transparent. They work in tandem with language. Explain your limits calmly and directly, without accusations, indicating time and format. Examples of these formats can be simple: an agreed response time, dedicated hours for creative work, a rule to answer calls from close ones immediately in emergencies. A system of boundaries must include exceptions, and those exceptions should be described in advance. That way, boundaries become a tool of freedom, not an excuse for closedness. At the end, boundaries need to be drawn clearly. Boundaries give freedom only if they are regularly reviewed, motivations are clear, and there is respect for the world around you. They require courage to say no or later, and flexibility to revise the decision when the situation changes. You can start with one small limit and observe how it affects your ability to be responsible to yourself. Through this work, an internal scale appears that allows you to act by your laws and remain connected with others. This is the discipline of boundaries, which makes solitude a source of autonomy rather than isolation. The rule is both simple and a strict discipline at the same time. Attention needs to be trained as an instrument. Attention is not a given, but a procedure, a set of concrete techniques that turn scatter into a stable ability to concentrate. Formulate the rule for yourself clearly. One action, one time window, one intention. This format turns dispersed time into an ordered resource. A brief conclusion from this rule. Regular attention practice changes the character of choice. When you develop a habit of sustaining focus, decisions stop being random flashes of reaction and become the result of sustained reflection. Immanuel Kant reminded us of the autonomy of the will, and attention acts as an everyday technique that builds this autonomy step by step.
The question that tensely arises in the path of any practice is, what pulls you out of a state of concentration and why holding attention proves harder than it seems? Modern technologies make constant claims on time and emotion, and a culture of multitasking cultivates the feeling of needing to be in several places at once. Martin Heidegger helped us understand that being is tied to care, and that care today is fragmented into many small objects, each demanding a response. Next, the mechanism. Switches accumulate into habits. Each time you interrupt the flow of thought for an external stimulus, a neural pathway forms that makes the next disruptive reaction easier. The limits of attention blur, concentration shrinks, and the mission of actions loses depth. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of training the will as a task of constant work on oneself. The same words apply to attention, because the power to hold focus is born in the repetition of small efforts. The consequences are felt in the moral dimension as well. When attention is superficial, conversations remain at the level of cliches, obligations are fulfilled formally, and empathy is reduced to a gesture. Søren Kierkegaard emphasized the importance of an inner relation to the world. One who cannot listen to their own state easily loses the ability to genuinely listen to another. The move toward resolution begins with a set of practical rules that are easy to run through each day. The first rule: limit the inflow of information. Set aside short, uninterrupted windows, for example from 20 to 45 minutes, during which you work with a single object. The second rule: a format for entering work. Before starting a task, formulating 2 sentences, the goal and the criterion for completion. The third rule: external anchors. The quiet tick of a clock, a paper notebook, notifications turned off. These 3 simple templates return attention to the center of action. One evening you switched off your phone and wrote 3 items on a sheet. What is important today? What requires attention tomorrow? What can be postponed? Half an hour later your thoughts cleared, and the decision appeared by itself. This micro-episode shows how a concrete ritual translates an abstract idea into a tangible result. Practice also includes exercises for the body and breath. A short walk without headphones, concentrating on the step and the breath, restores attention better than multitasking. Reading a few paragraphs aloud slowly and thoughtfully, then writing down key thoughts on paper strengthens the link between perception and memory. Keeping an observation journal, noting moments when your focus broke and what you did to restore it, turns experience into material for learning. Integrating this technique into relationships and work is important. Attention is a promise you make to yourself and to others. Agree with colleagues on times when you are available and when you are not, and keep those promises as an expression of respect for your practice. At meetings, train yourself to listen to one question fully before offering an answer. This small effort raises the quality of dialogue and sustains the depth of joint decisions. Finally, the rule of review. Set regular intervals for revision. Every 2 weeks, look at how the chosen forms of attention are working. Change time windows, adjust rituals, describe results. Attention is an adaptive technique. Constant tuning maintains its strength. If done systematically, the skill of concentrating will stop being an episodic victory and become part of your manner of existing, shaping the character of actions and the meaning of relationships. It is important to remember, learning attention does not tolerate self-deception and immediate miracles. It requires patience, honesty with yourself, and the readiness to return to practice even after failures. At the same time, it is important to distinguish effort from coercion. Attention cannot be forced any more than you can force yourself to feel a sincere emotion. The fine line between discipline and coercion is defined by a sense of comfort. If you are burning out, the method must be softened, not abandoned.
Small victories matter more than sharp ruptures. Mark progress even if it seems insignificant. It strengthens motivation and creates habit. If you work in a group, share your experience. Tell your colleagues about your rituals and ask them to be part of the support. This creates an ecosystem of attentiveness. Do not forget about boundaries. Sometimes the best care for attention is rest, restoration, and simply allowing yourself to be unproductive for short periods. Your task is not to achieve perfection, but to form a system that works in real life, flexible, resilient, and humane. The practice of mindfulness is linked to honesty with yourself. Record which distractions repeat, which ideas were useful, which habits need to be removed. Define timeframes for experiments. Try a week without social networks, or alternate days of deep work and light tasks. After a month, compare how you feel. How much easier is it to get into a task? How long does it take to recover focus? Which decisions have become better? If changes are significant, consolidate them through habits and rituals. If not, change the approach or reduce the load without blaming yourself. Remember, attention is not a destination, but a way of life that you build step by step. Start today with a small step. Solitude for creativity appears as two forces at once. The image of the fiery genius exploding form, and the cold workshop where work and time make the idea mature. First, what makes solitude productive? Space free from constant social replies gives the opportunity to enter a state of prolonged work where thought develops like a body engaged in repetition and correction. Friedrich Nietzsche described the will as constant work on oneself. Creative will requires the same efforts of discipline and repetition that form judgment over one's taste. In this sense, solitude is not a pause from the world, but a field for the craft of thought and form. Next, the mechanism. Having time without external expectations allows images to age. We perform internal experiments, try a form, break it, return to tangible elements, and join them again. Ludwig Wittgenstein pushed the idea to its limit that clarity comes through working with language, through correcting words and formulations. Such labor occurs in solitude because an external audience encourages premature completion, polishing the surface instead of deepening the structure. A brief conclusion about the value of this mechanism. When you have time and rules for your work, the product becomes not the result of a sudden flash, but a stage of carefully layered strata. Søren Kierkegaard spoke of inner tension as a source of authenticity. Creativity requires this tension, but the tension must have shape and measure. The question that often arises: where is the boundary between fruitful solitude and stagnation? The boundary is defined by two things. First, the presence of a critical standard to which you subject your work. Second, regular contact with reality, which tests assumptions. Simone de Beauvoir wrote about freedom attained through action, and action presupposes meeting others. Creative work in a closed loop can yield perfection of technique, but lacks the mirror that reflects meaning and significance. An expanded thought on the structure of practice. Allocate parts of work for solitude, parts for review, and parts for external critique. Organize rituals. Hours when no one interferes, and windows when the work is open for feedback. Accepting such rules shapes a rhythm in which solitude becomes an instrument rather than an end. The workshop as an institute of habits is an expression of careful regard for the process of creation. Next, on the inner dynamics. Solitude heightens the sensual attention to material. In the silence, a raw sheet of paper, a line, the sound of a brush break gain meanings that are lost in noise. Ludwig Wittgenstein taught that meaning appears in the details of language. A creative detail begins to speak when it is heard in quiet. This hearing develops through repetition and through the willingness to stay long with the unfinished until it reveals its form. However, solitude also breeds illusions. Work without external checks tends towards self-justification and cultivating a taste understandable only to oneself. To limit this risk, introduce reality tests, public readings, swapping drafts, answering a specific critical question. Such practices turn the solitary laboratory into a living organism, where the product meets the outside world and gains energy for the next cycle of work. The moral side of creativity in solitude deserves separate attention. Solitude forms honesty toward the material and toward one's intent. Friedrich Nietzsche asserted that authenticity requires the courage to be alone in one's decisions. This courage shows in the ability to admit the weak parts of the work and in the persistence to correct them. Here, solitude acts as an exam of fidelity to an idea, not as proof of the author's exceptionality. A practical conclusion in the form of a rule. Do solitary work systematically, but always place it in a cycle of checks with others. Separate stages: research in quiet, refinement in isolation, testing in interaction. Such a cycle keeps creative tension productive and prevents immersion into a closed space where ideas lose connection with what makes them meaningful. In the end, I note a principle you can take back to the workshop. Solitude for creativity is not a melodrama of inspiration. It is the discipline of attention and time, a laboratory for transforming material into meanings. By patiently maintaining the practice and testing the result in contact with the world, you turn solitude into a tool that makes work deeper and stronger. And one more thing. Solitude is first of all responsibility. When you remain alone with the material, you take upon yourself not only freedom, but also the obligation of truth toward your work and toward those for whom it is intended. This means not only honesty in choosing a topic, but also honesty in refusing easy consolations, public recognition, fashionable effects, superficial technique. Solitude gives time, but time must be mastered, turned into method, not an excuse for endless delay. The practice of such responsibility implies the skill of self-assessment and tools to support it. Record the criteria to which you will return in a month or a year. Fix small checks of progress. Ask yourself, what is this for and who will need it? In these questions, solitude becomes discipline rather than a theater of self-satisfaction. It is important to remember that an artistic product lives in relationships with the reader, viewer, listener. And these relationships must be cultivated. Finally, the relation to solitude should be flexible. Sometimes a long stretch is needed for experiments. Sometimes a quick call to a friend who will diagnose the issue in 5 minutes. Learn to switch between modes. Then, solitude will not become a trap, but will turn into a space where not only an object is formed, but also the ability to see further, hear more vividly, and take responsibility for every word and line. Remember, solitude is a tool that requires care and honesty, and then it serves the work, not the ego. Without flattery and farce, solitude can be a political gesture of autonomy, when withdrawal inward becomes a means to tell society that you do not submit to its expectations. It is not simply a personal refuge. It is an act that contains a demand to reinterpret your role and your availability in the public sphere. This is best explained through the notion of a gesture. A gesture attracts attention not by its word, but by creating a new point of reference. Absence becomes a sign. When a person consciously makes their disappearance visible, it communicates the boundary they have set against power and demanding social roles. Such withdrawal organizes a space of autonomy, not technically, but symbolically. It changes the rules of interaction, forces a revision of habitual regimes of responsibility and expectation. As a result, power can no longer count on automatic involvement. Autonomy demands recognition. Next, it is important to consider how this gesture operates on the level of social practices. Withdrawing to oneself can undermine mechanisms of legitimation that rely on the repeatability of roles. When action is tied to a role, workplace, family duty, social status, refusal to participate interrupts the flow of legitimacy. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote of freedom as decision, as the moment when the subject takes responsibility for their being. Political withdrawal is a decision of this kind, visible and risky, because it forces others to respond to the absence. That response opens a space for new forms of reciprocity and for a revision of the rules by which people behave. The key question is who perceives this gesture and how it is read. There are situations in which withdrawal remains private and loses political power, and cases where it becomes an event the society is compelled to relate to. Henry David Thoreau described withdrawal as a way to protest unjust orders by consciously limiting participation. In the modern world, communication means affect, whether solitude becomes a political act. The visibility of the gesture is determined not only by the intent of the withdrawer, but also by the willingness of others to notice and interpret the absence. Therefore, solitude as a political gesture needs a form that makes it addressable. The boundary of the concept runs where withdrawal loses the ability to demand a response. If solitude remains completely closed and leaves no trace, it stays a personal strategy of self-preservation. Political power appears in those cases when withdrawal produces consequences for common practices and causes a redistribution of attention and responsibility. Hannah Arendt emphasized the importance of publicity as a condition of political action. Actions gain meaning and effect precisely where they meet others and receive continuation. Lack of continuation means the gesture becomes an internal act, important for the subject, but devoid of political conversion. The practical side of such a gesture requires caution and technique. Take the notion of legibility. The gesture should leave a trace that society can read. This can be a symbolic action, a sustained pause in communication, refusal to participate in certain institutions that serve as mechanisms of control. Michel Foucault analyzed how everyday practices form subjects and how changing these practices alters types of subjection. When withdrawal is organized as a change in everydayness, it stops being merely a personal strategy and becomes an intervention in regimes of power. Consistency and public recognizability matter because political meaning lives in the response of others. Finally, there is a moral moment that links autonomy and responsibility. Political withdrawal is not an escape from obligations altogether. It is a choice to intentionally change the format of obligations. When you choose detachment as a political tactic, think about which obligations you thereby shift onto society and what traces you intend to leave. Such an approach requires discipline and honesty with yourself. Withdrawal without clarity of goals and forms easily loses influence and becomes merely personal trauma. Jean-Paul Sartre and Michel Foucault pointed differently to the price of freedom. Freedom as decision and freedom as practice require the readiness not only to withdraw, but to accept the consequences of withdrawal. Solitude becomes political when it translates inner refusal into a public sign and into a reorganization of the holdings of power. The boundary of this force passes through legibility and through the continuation of action. Hannah Arendt reminded us that politics develops in the common space. If withdrawal generates a new common language, it is political. Henry David Thoreau left the idea that minimizing participation can be a form of protest. Carefully shape your gesture so that it leaves a trace society can read and to which it will be forced to respond. Then, solitude moves from the realm of the personal into the sphere of political meaning and becomes a tool of autonomy that both demands and grants responsibility. But it is important to remember the risks. Political solitude can easily turn into symbolic isolation if it is not accompanied by a clear position and a connection to community. The gesture of withdrawal requires form, consistent explanation, boundaries, and timeframes that make it interpretable and responsible. Ways to redistribute obligations are also needed so that one person's withdrawal does not become an additional burden for the vulnerable. This is possible through creating support networks, public declarations, and collective practices that accept and work through the traces of absence. Political solitude, framed as an honest and considered choice, can become a catalyst for change, but only if there is a readiness not to hide consequences and to maintain dialogue. At the same time, it is important to avoid moralizing and theatrical martyrdom. The gesture must remain honest toward one's own motivation and not turn into an instrument of manipulating attention. Exact forms may differ, but the principle of clarity is obligatory. The readiness to accept consequences is necessary. Solitude leaves memory, but that memory does not always lead to the formation of character. Often, experiences of isolation remain fragmented segments that are not woven into a coherent line of life. The memories become a background layer you can glance into from time to time, but which doesn't guide actions or change habits. The problem is that the memory of solitude by itself doesn't guarantee internal transformation. For that, special conditions are needed that can turn a personal archive into a tutor of character. What criteria must memory meet in order to truly educate? The first criterion is coherence. Memories must have a course. One must be able to assemble them into a sequence that forms a narrative about who you were and who you are becoming. The second criterion is embodiment. The remembering of events should leave a trace not only in words, but also in the body. Movements, rituals, the way of breathing indicate how experience is integrated into everyday life. The third criterion is evaluative quality. Memory must pass through the filter of judgment. Without reflection, experiences remain unsystematic impressions. The fourth criterion is a social form. Memory that remains completely isolated and closed to feedback loses its stability and runs the risk of losing meaning in the eyes of others. These criteria work together. The absence of even one makes the process of formation fragile. What observing these criteria gives? If memories are coherent and embodied, they become a resource for self-governance. A person is less susceptible to impulses because they have a foothold in past experience that serves as a reference point. Friedrich Nietzsche reflected on how the past can serve as training of the will. The presence of a disciplining memory makes choices more mature
and less led by momentary attractiveness. When the evaluation of experiences is integrated, a moral dimension appears, allowing one to track the causes of desires and to distinguish the fleeting from the significant. The social form makes memory plastic. When you share excerpts of your solitude, those excerpts are tested and can gain a new resonance in relationships. How this transformation is arranged in practice. Coherence is achieved through storytelling and reinterpretation. Embodiment is secured through habits and rituals. Evaluative quality is obtained through an honest conversation with oneself about values and consequences. The form of social verification is built through oral or written testimonies. Maurice Merleau-Ponty insisted that the body stores the meaning of experience differently from language. Therefore, words without hands, posture, and breathing often fade. Søren Kierkegaard emphasized the significance of the inward weight of decisions. Memory that doesn't carry the weight of a made decision remains ephemeral. The consequences of careless treatment of the memory of solitude can vary, but are always tangible. Fragmented memories tend toward emotional fragmentation. The past can come alive as a source of anxiety or as an occasion for repeated unsuccessful attempts. Character in that case is not tempered but maimed by small, repeated mistakes. Memory deprived of critical understanding becomes a factory of excuses, where past decisions are used to sustain current weaknesses. Hannah Arendt wrote about publicity as a condition of understanding and responsibility. If the memory of solitude does not pass through a form of public acknowledgement, it risks losing the capacity to influence behavior in the general context. An internal image helps to feel what is happening. The memory of solitude can be imagined as a stone that you hammer into shape for years. If each strike is deliberate and invested with meaning, the stone is formed into a statue of character. If the strikes are chaotic or absent, the stone remains a cobble that obstructs the road but is not capable of changing its direction. This image shows the difference between passive accumulation and the active work of memory. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of self-creation as a craft, where the past works as material. Michel de Montaigne noted the value of writing for clarifying thoughts. Here, writing functions as a tool for forming coherence and evaluative quality. The boundary of memory's influence runs along several lines. The first line is time. If a memory becomes too blurred because of prolonged inactivity, restoring coherence becomes more difficult. The second line is trauma. Experience that re-traumatizes can lock memory into a protective shell, making it unavailable for reflection. The third line is social amnesia. When those around you refuse to see and hear the traces of your solitude, memory loses its field of action and stops correcting behavior. These boundaries indicate where intervention is necessary to preserve the educative force of solitary memories. What practices help keep memory in working order? The first is the regular rendering of experience into word or action, that is, translating sensation into structure. The second is physical anchors, repeatable gestures, places and rhythms that return you to the nuances of an experience. The third is sincere judgments about your motives and their consequences, which prevent memory from taking the form of self-justification. The fourth is exchange with others, which tests how your memories operate in the common field, and which conclusions from them can be recognized as shared. These practices support the criteria of coherence, embodiment, evaluative quality, and social form.
If you want solitude to educate your character, make sure memory does not remain a random store of impressions. Create order for your memories, give them form, anchor them in the body, and subject them to verification. Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Søren Kierkegaard reminded us of the complexity of inner life. Hannah Arendt and Michel de Montaigne showed that testing and recording make it fit for the shared world. The limit of this power is clear. Memory works as long as it can be linked, relived, and acknowledged. Beyond the boundary of coherence, memory ceases to be a teacher and become merely the echo of a lost possibility. The inner court acts as a mechanism that links action with evaluation in real time. It consists of three interconnected elements. The first element is a prescription, formulated in your consciousness as a rule or principle that can be short and clear. The second element is a feeling, doubt or prompt of conscience, that arises when faced with a choice. The third element is a reflexive break, a pause that gives time to measure the impulse against the established rule. These three components work as a feedback loop. The rule generates an expectation. The feeling signals a conflict. The pause allows behavior to be brought into agreement with those expectations, or to correct them. The inner court relies not only on abstract formulas, but also on the body and memory. Immanuel Kant wrote about autonomy as the ability to act according to a law you set for yourself. This law becomes real only when it produces a bodily response: quickened breathing, a lump in the throat, a readiness to look away. Søren Kierkegaard emphasized the depth of the subjective experience of decision, which carries the weight of responsibility. If a rule exists only as a verbal construct, it remains a dead declaration. When the same principle evokes bodily resonance and becomes part of your habits, it begins to function as the motor of moral behavior. A brief conclusion about the mechanics. The inner court is a synthesis of rule, feeling, and reflection that translates abstract obligations into concrete acts through bodily and temporal delay. It does not operate automatically. It requires memory and attentiveness. Why this mechanism is needed. In the global network of social roles and expectations, internal checking becomes the only place where you remain the sole author of your decisions. External evaluation can stimulate correct behavior, but it does not make you responsible in the sense in which responsibility is born from within. When a decision passes through the inner court, it bears the stamp of your I. Friedrich Nietzsche studied the origins of conscience and noted that moral experience often arises as an inner preoccupation that transforms external prohibitions into personal obligations. Without this transformation, action remains driven by habit or fear of punishment, rather than an expression of mature choice. In practical terms, the inner court is needed to preserve the unity of intention and action. It makes possible the closeness between what you say and what you do, that is the basis of trust in yourself. When you find yourself alone, this mechanism becomes the only judge of your deeds. And it is precisely in solitude that the depth to which your moral orientations have been internalized is tested. How this court is formed and how it is consolidated. Formation occurs through repetition, through rituals, and through honest retrospection. Writing helps fix principles and track their change. The measure of discipline is manifested in the habit of pausing before a decision,
in the ability to listen to bodily signals. If you want to see it in action, imagine the moment when you find someone else's wallet on the street, sit on a bench, and feel not only a thought about the rightness of returning it, but also a slight tension in your hand, as if the body demands an answer. This short contact between sensation and action is the work of the inner court. Where the mechanism breaks and why. The first breakdown is the dampening of the bodily signal. When emotions are constantly muted by drugs, alcohol, or the habit of avoiding the unpleasant, the pause disappears, and with it, the chance for reflection. The second breakdown is rationalization, when arguments and justifications drown out the voice of conscience and turn it into a set of logical computations suitable for self-soothing. The third breakdown is fragmentation of memory, in which principles exist separately from concrete cases and are not connected to experience. This makes them powerless at the moment of choice. Hannah Arendt pointed out that responsibility includes the ability to speak about one's actions publicly. If the inner court does not undergo the test of communication, it loses weight and becomes ephemeral. The consequences of these failures are varied. A muted court makes you vulnerable to repeating mistakes because there is no clear bodily reaction to a breach of a rule. Rationalization turns morality into an apparatus of justification and deprives action of authenticity. Fragmentation of memory makes it impossible to correct behavior based on past experience. When the inner court is destroyed, personal morality is reduced to an external keyboard of reactions to situations, rather than to a stable awareness. What can be done to keep the mechanism working longer? It is strengthened by simple, regular practices. The first practice is daily written reflection, recording not only acts, but also the bodily sensations that accompanied them. The second practice is the deliberate creation of pauses, a breathing exercise, a short walk before an important decision. The third practice is testing principles in small matters, where the stakes are low, but you can observe the connection between decision and sensation. The fourth practice is public acknowledgement, at least within a small circle, which checks how your inner assessment coincides with others' evaluations. Maurice Merleau-Ponty reminded us of the inseparable connection between body and meaning. Attention to bodily reactions strengthens the court's work and makes it resilient. Conclusion. The inner court is the motor of moral existence in solitude, the mechanism that translates memory, principle, and sensation into action. Its strength is measured by how ready you are to hear the slightest signal within yourself and to endure the pause between impulse and action. I believe that the discipline of these small things preserves you in the face of great temptations. If you want to preserve the honesty of your life, care for your inner court as tenderly as for an instrument that determines the direction of the road. How does it happen that solitude, experienced with attention, becomes a resource for intimacy rather than a barrier that shuts you off from others? Solitude, endured as a practice, changes the structure of desire. In seclusion, the ability is formed to demand from relationships not the feeling of a deficit, but the joint participation of two autonomous lives. This is not about distance for the sake of distance. It is about clarity. You see your needs without distortion by another's expectation. And it becomes easier to distinguish the desire for connection from the need to be rescued from inner anxiety. Emmanuel Levinas taught that ethical relation begins
with responsibility to the other. And that responsibility does not lose force when you are alone with yourself. On the contrary, solitude makes responsibility conscious, because the absence of another's opinion leaves only your personal answer. What qualities relationships acquire when they grow out of such solitude? The first quality is transparency of intentions. You choose to enter into a bond, not to heal a wound, but to share part of a life. The second quality is stability of boundaries. Boundaries cease to be a protective wall and become a platform for joint self-determination. The third quality is the ability to listen. The ability to listen not as a means of reaction, but as a way of keeping another's speech within oneself and returning it with respect. Simone de Beauvoir spoke of freedom as a condition of love, and in solitude, freedom is consolidated by the practice of independent decisions that are then brought into the relationship as a mature contribution. What processes inside the person make such maturity possible? Inner order is the development of the skill to recognize your own motives and to distinguish them from the voices of social role-playing. Language becomes an instrument of precision. You learn to articulate your need so that it is understandable to another without losing its form. The memory of solitude serves as a repository of experienced events. It accumulates the successes and failures of close bonds, turning them into rules of practice rather than prohibitions. Maurice Merleau-Ponty reminded us of the body as a bearer of meaning. And here, bodily awareness preserves information about trust and breaches of trust. It tells you when it is possible to deepen a bond and when restoration is required. What skills need to be developed in order to bring solitary presence into relationships? Attention to oneself, regular reflection, the habit of holding a pause before demanding an answer from a partner. All this works as a trainer of maturity. The practice of honesty starts small, with the ability to speak about your limits without expecting immediate sympathy. The exchange of such sincere messages forms a climate in which two people can remain autonomous and at the same time strive for a shared form of life. Hannah Arendt noted the importance of the public word for responsibility. Here, the word becomes public between two people, and its truth is tested in joint life. What are the signs of relationships where solitude has not been used as an instrument of growth? First of all, it is a confusion of desires. When a connection is built on the expectation of filling an inner void, partners begin to demand emotional compensation, and speech turns into a list of demands. The second sign is blurred boundaries, when personal habits and needs merge into aimless dependence. The third sign is the absence of stable practices that help build and restore trust after ruptures. These signals serve as indicators that solitude has not become preparation, but has turned into avoidance of responsibility. The limit of this idea is clear. The talk is about that solitude which is cultivated as a discipline of attention and as a space for forming the self. It does not discuss the social causes of mass isolation and does not offer recipes for treating clinical depression. The focus is on how personal work in solitude affects the quality of interpersonal connection. If you want your relationships to be based on mature intimacy, start with the practice of independent decision-making. Anchor in body and word your ability to be a separate person who enters a union by consent, not by necessity. Start small. Define your boundaries verbally and in writing. Practice refusing without excuses. Reclaim time for restoration. Inventory your internal resources. What nourishes you? What exhausts you? Note which topics trigger old wounds and require careful handling. In a couple, this turns into regular rituals. A brief exchange about important things at the start of the week, pauses in an argument to restore breath, agreements on ways of asking for support that do not turn a request into an accusation. It is important to distinguish autonomy from alienation. Autonomy allows two people to be genuine. Alienation is when both lives exist in parallel, not meeting. A sign of healthy autonomy is the ability to separate and then reintegrate. You can temporarily withdraw into yourself and then return ready to share.
The skill grows in solitude, where you learn to finish the inner dialogue before drawing another into it. Practices that help keep solitude as a resource: diary writing of experiences, meditative techniques, creative work that supports an inner rhythm. Another important element is the art of forgiveness, primarily of oneself. Solitude sometimes brings the bitterness of realizing mistakes, and the ability to forgive your imperfection frees up space for genuine closeness. When two people come with such baggage, conflict ceases to be a stage of war and becomes an opportunity to learn the other's facets. In dialogue, a subtlety appears. Questions are open, answers are not used as weapons, and silence no longer requires immediate filling. Thus, an attitude is formed in which closeness is not dissolution, but the consonance of two orchestras. After all, solitude undergone consciously is not an exception to life, but its foundation. It teaches you to be present beside another without gripping them in the palm of expectation, offering instead a hand that knows the way back to itself. And then closeness stops demanding when solitude turns into a source of responsibility for desires. The world of your choices changes in quality. Desires no longer remain private flashes that can simply be gratified and forgotten. They become assertions about who you are and who you want to be. The consequences are visible in how you build relationships, how you take on obligations, and how you assess your willingness to pay the price for what you want. This is not about erecting rules for the sake of rules. It is about the fact that each desire carries with it the demand to accept the consequences of your actions. And this demand makes you predictable to others and honest with yourself. Why such a transformation is possible? Solitude gives space for rethinking urges. It slows down the reflective process and takes desire out of the immediate field of reaction into the field of prolonged consideration. When there are no external voices, an internal dialogue remains, and in it, answers to the question of the price of desire are formed. The memory of solitude accumulates the experience of prior attempts and their results. Language sharpens the phrasing of requests. The body keeps impressions of past trust and betrayal. Immanuel Kant wrote about the autonomy of the will as the ability to set laws for oneself. Here, autonomy manifests as the ability to subject desire to some criterion of reasonableness and responsibility. Martin Heidegger proposed the idea of authenticity as acceptance of one's being in fullness. And the practice of solitude creates conditions in which a desire either confirms your authenticity or indicates the superficiality of the motivation. A clarification about what a responsible desire is. A desire is responsible when it is stable and connected to a life project, when you are ready to acknowledge possible losses and to take on the consequences of their occurrence. A whim is different and is designated otherwise. It is short-lived, demands immediate satisfaction, and does not include calculation of consequences. Desire manifests in the ability to plan
and in the readiness to speak about it aloud, even if that means facing another's disagreement. In language, this is expressed differently. Desire requires a formulation that can be discussed. A whim presents itself as a demand that will not tolerate verification. Friedrich Nietzsche insisted that deep striving is linked to strength and creative will, and this distinction helps see which impulses support personal development and which lead into repeating circles of impulsive behavior. How to test your desire for responsibility without an external arbiter. First, it is worth fixing it in words and in time. A concrete formulation and an attempt to imagine the consequences act as a stress test. Then, it is useful to see whether this aspiration fits into a broader life project, whether it is ready for compromises, and whether it can withstand refusal. Emmanuel Levinas reminded that responsibility manifests itself in relation to the other as a demanding person. Desire that does not take into account the consequences for other people does not withstand ethical scrutiny. Hannah Arendt valued the publicity of speech as a test of truth, and even in the intimate sphere, testing desire by word and by promise brings it closer to responsibility. Bodily memory will indicate how much this desire resonates with the experience of trust and how much anxiety it produces. Anxiety points to an unresolved task, while calm resolve points to a mature motive. A connection to a practice you can take on. Try introducing into your life stages in which desire passes through successive filters: formulation, waiting, evaluation of consequences, and a public word to the person it affects. This is not a recipe for quick success, but a discipline that trains responsibility. I notice that the simplest threshold is enough to distinguish a fleeting urge from a genuine need. The willingness to endure a period of waiting and the willingness to accept the outcome of the chosen action. When you implement such a check systematically, desires begin to form character, not only to satisfy momentary needs. The consequences for relationships and for inner life turn out to be deep. Relationships built on such tested desires gain predictability of intention and the capacity for shared responsibility. Within you appears a habit of answering for what moves you, and this disciplines passion without smothering it. My aim is not to give a set of rules, but to emphasize that solitude can become a school of responsibility. Then, every desire ceases to be merely a passing attraction. It becomes an element of a life project that you can consciously maintain and, if necessary, correct. Responsibility requires not rejection of desire, but its transformation. Instead of immediate consumption, there appears the skill of placing the longing into the context of values and obligations. This does not make you colder. On the contrary, you learn to safeguard what truly matters and to distinguish it from illusions. The practice of solitude, if directed consciously, teaches patience and develops the ability to see consequences broadly, not only deeply, how they will affect others, your future, and the relationships you want to preserve. The sequence of actions is simple and flexible. Name the desire, give it time, discuss it with those it affects, and imagine two scenarios, the best and the worst. If you are ready to live with both, then that desire passes the test. If not, perhaps it is a signal to rethink. Such an approach does not guarantee the absence of mistakes, but it reduces the likelihood of repeating the same wounds and makes you a more predictable partner. Ultimately, responsibility toward your desires is at once an act of love for yourself and for others. Respect for your own longings combines with care for the other's boundary.
Solitude here becomes a laboratory for experience, where you learn not only to dream, but to be accountable for your dreams. This skill requires time and practice. Small tests and honest conversations gradually form the habit of answering for your longings and accepting the results. And so, I conduct a small experiment with myself. One evening a week without screens, without answering messages, with one book and a cup of tea. This particular case shows how a simple limit can change the perception of time and taste. An evening that previously spilled between flashing windows becomes a dedication to a single ritual. You feel the density of the moment, notice details you previously missed, and realize how much you lose when attention is dispersed. From this specificity grows a broader idea. Self-limitation turns into an aesthetic principle, a way of shaping your life through a chosen form. Rules are not containers for will, but strokes with which you draw your own mode of existence. Limitation gives lines sharpness, helps to distinguish the main from background noise, and cultivates a taste for those things that endure repetition. Aesthetics in this sense is not about outward beauty, but about coherence between desire, action, and time. When you set boundaries intentionally, they work like a picture frame. Within it, elements begin to interact differently. A composition emerges. Why frames have such power? Immanuel Kant linked autonomy with the ability to set laws for oneself. When you introduce a rule, you manifest this autonomy in practice.
Friedrich Nietzsche noted that the will to power takes the form of discipline if the discipline serves the enhancement of life. Michel Foucault studied technologies of the self and showed how practices of limitation shape subjectivity through regularity and control. These thoughts converge on a simple conclusion. Limitations are capable not only of restraining impulses, they model ways of feeling and thinking, create habits that then function as an aesthetic framework of behavior. Analyzing the mechanism reveals three notable effects. First, limitation provides an economy of attention. When contacts are fewer, the quality of each increases. Second, a boundary allows taste to become more complex. Choices are repeated, and each subsequent iteration comes with a finer demand for quality. Third, a rule becomes a mirror in which you can see who you become under the pressure of constant practice. This analytic move helps to understand why self-control is perceived not as deprivation, but as craft, as the ability to work with your own edges to obtain a finished work of life. There is a simple test that works as a miniature example. Choose one thing to give up for a month and notice how your relationship to other pleasures changes. 1 week without a screen can open tastes that were previously suppressed. Such a trial makes it possible to see the effect of limitation in action and to understand whether the rule truly enriches experience or merely creates a sense of loss. However, the aesthetics of self-limitation has limits and conditions of its appropriateness. Limitations require the freedom to introduce them and the ability to revise them. Obligation imposed from outside and associated with shame or fear deprives them of aesthetic value. Economic and bodily circumstances impose constraints that do not lend elegance to choice. When a person lacks the ability to choose, talking about an aesthetics of limitations loses meaning. Furthermore, the intensity and duration of practice must correspond to the goal. A rule that is too strict will turn life into a monotonous suit that robs one of joy. The boundaries of applicability look like this. A limitation should be commensurate with resources and serve the expression of a value, not the image of virtue. Hannah Arendt emphasized the importance of action and the publicity of speech as a way to test thought. In these terms, an aesthetic limitation retains meaning when it can be explained and shared, when it enters the fabric of relationships rather than remaining a secret demand made of oneself. Immanuel Kant will again remind us of the necessity of moral lawfulness, and the very form of limitation must be compatible with respect for others and for oneself. Practical limits force concreteness. A limitation makes sense if you are able to measure its effect and correct it if necessary. A rule that does not allow for revision becomes a dogma. A rule that ignores physical health will turn into a harmful habit. A rule imposed by ideology or a sense of guilt does not create an aesthetic. It reproduces coercion. Friedrich Nietzsche warned about the death of creative power when discipline becomes an end in itself. This thought serves as a reminder of the need to check the source of motivation. Limitations also affect relationships. When you give up what used to be shared time, you need to articulate this to loved ones to avoid misunderstanding. Self-limitation becomes the aesthetics of shared space if it includes dialogue and respect for the boundaries of others. Michel Foucault helps us see that disciplining oneself in a social context is always connected with relations of power. The aesthetics of limitations remains healthy only under conditions of equal participation and understanding. Conclusion: from the particular to the general, and then to limitations. One evening without a screen is an experience that shows the power of a frame. The aesthetics of self-limitation turns frames into a form of life that gives quality and taste. At the same time, it requires freedom of choice, revision, and accord with the conditions of the body and society. Rules that have stood the test of time and have been verified by meaning become part of your style, but each of them must have an ultimate boundary of adjustability. If you introduce a frame, do it like an artist who knows that a frame is needed for a painting, but the painting requires light and ventilation to remain alive. Choose one simple rule and turn it into a ritual, a short sequence of actions repeated regularly and protected from outside interference. A ritual should not be cumbersome. Its strength is in form and constancy. When an action acquires form, it ceases to be accidental and becomes a support for attention, for memory, and for character. Thus, resilience of experience is born. Not the habit itself is important, but the coherence of meanings that the ritual sustains each time you perform it. A brief conclusion. A ritual lives on the edge between technique and meaning. This conclusion is important to keep in mind when choosing a practice. Why a ritual can bring tension. The desire to make a ritual beautiful easily turns into pressure. A routine order begins to demand strict observance, and then the ritual stops nourishing inner life and starts servicing it. Pressure appears at 3 points. First, external expectations, demands from work, family, or social norms. Press on the ability to keep the rule. Second, internal motivation can run dry if the ritual becomes solely a way to demonstrate one's discipline. Third, bodily and economic limitations interfere when the body or circumstances do not allow maintaining regularity. These 3 sources of tension narrow the meaning of the ritual and substitute its form. Examining each point of tension more closely, you see different symptoms. External expectations appear as guilt if the ritual is not maintained, and as an expectation from others that you will always be available in your allotted time. Internal motivation sometimes turns into self-punishment when the goal becomes a politics of willpower. Bodily and material limits halt regularity and make the ritual inaccessible to those who cannot afford it. The horizon of consequences extends beyond private practice. The ritual affects relationships and the allocation of your life's resources. Summing up, Tension is an indicator of a ritual's vulnerability. Tension shows where intervention is needed and what should be reconsidered so that the ritual remains substantive, not merely decorative. Imagine the ritual as a small garden you arrange inside yourself. The garden requires regular care, but the same procedure does not always serve development. The soil must be changed, seeds chosen according to the season, watering adjusted to the weather. Without flexibility, the garden will become overgrown and lose its effect. This figurative picture helps to understand that the form of the ritual is valuable only when it is linked to sensitivity to the situation and to the body. The point of the image is that a ritual requires both discipline and sensitivity. Immanuel Kant reminds us of the necessity of freely establishing the rules of one's own will, and this libretto of autonomy is important to preserve. The ritual must be chosen, not imposed. Michel Foucault taught to consider practices of the self as technical devices that shape subjectivity. It is useful to look at a ritual as a technology that works on your self-experience. Friedrich Nietzsche stressed that discipline can intensify life if it is aimed at creating and expressing one's own strength. Hannah Arendt pointed to the importance of doing in the public sphere, which reminds us of the necessity to explain our practices and include others in understanding the meaning of our rituals when they affect shared life. Comparing discipline and sensitivity, you arrive at a practical principle for resolving tension. The first requirement is intentionality. Name the goal of the ritual and determine the minimal set of actions that express it. The second requirement is measurability of changes. Note what exactly changes in your experience, in attention, or in relation to people. The third requirement is flexibility of boundaries. The ritual has a structure, but the structure allows modification in response to health, work, and relationships. The fourth requirement is transparency in close relationships. If the ritual affects shared time, communicate its meaning and timing so that it does not become a hidden cause of conflict. Tension is relieved through concrete practices that preserve form and give it substance. Protect the time, but do not guard it against all changes. Fix the rule, but check its meaning monthly. Make the ritual bodily appropriate so that it nourishes rather than exhausts. These steps return a meaningful center to the ritual and give it the possibility to grow with you. The final thought sounds like this. Rituals of solitude are an art of form reinforced by attention to context. They build a person not through mechanical repetition, but through regular return to meaning. When you attend to your ritual, ask it questions and allow it to change. It ceases to be a foreign form and becomes your way of holding yourself in the world. Start small. 5 minutes in the morning. Just breathe. Write down the feeling before and after, a short note. If something breaks, reduce the scale and wait. Quieter. Share the ritual with those close to you. Explain why it exists. Note small victories. The reward is modest. Small. Check the ritual once a month. Ask yourself questions. Accept failure as information, a lesson, not a brand mark. Allow the ritual to give meaning, not only form. Turn rituals like tools, not like shackles. Look at the ritual through a friend's eyes. Curiosity is more important than judgment. Finally, the goal of the ritual is to sustain life. Always. Keep a ritual journal, dates and brief sensations. Plan breaks, rest for the ritual and recovery. Do not compare rituals. Each preserves its own value. Let the ritual be simple, the entry threshold low. Have. Collect examples. People adapt rituals. And learn. Do not make the ritual showy. Let it be a shelter. If others are near, ask for consent before retreating. Draw up a plan B if the ritual becomes unavailable. Yes, recovery is part of the ritual. Do not demand the miracle. The ritual should expand life, not consume it. Make the ritual accessible, a short instruction. Create a place for experiment. Try without shame. Observe the path. Record changes, not ideal. Everyone, believe in simplicity. A small ritual done often. Take a step. Solitude and public action lie side by side, like a quiet workshop and a stage. The workshop is a place of long preparation, where an object is worked on, polished, and given form. The stage is a place of testing, where the form enters into contact with the world and receives a response. This contrast sets the tone. Seclusion shapes what will later enter the world of action, and therefore the practice of seclusion itself should have the character of preparation, not escape. This preparation has a dense structure. In seclusion, material for argumentation is gathered. The habit of listening to one's own reasons is developed. Attention is detached from external imprints. Ideas become tempered. Moral intentions gain density. Small exercises in reasoning and written fixation consolidate forms of thinking that will later be suitable for public speech and for collective problem solving. The micro-conclusion here is simple. Seclusion increases the quality of internal tools. Pose the question like this: what turns seclusion into preparation and not into self-comfort? The answer lies in translating impressions into testable assertions, in the readiness to put your convictions to the test. When thought remains only in the head, it remains virtual. The process of transmission requires language, argumentation, readiness for feedback. This is translational work. Internal labor becomes external responsibility. Such a translation is the boundary between the private and the political. An image will help feel the difference. Imagine a smithy where a tool is forged with a hammer, and the square where the tool is used. The smithy is warm, enclosed, requiring attention to the material. The square is transparent, requiring the strength on the result. Immanuel Kant emphasized autonomy of will as an exercise of inner discipline. His thought reveals the idea that preparation must be freely accepted. This freedom of choosing the rules of one's own actions makes the workshop moral. Public action also requires the language of common sense. The readiness to step into the field of public conversation means translating private orientations into general grounds for action. Hannah Arendt wrote about the significance of the public sphere as a space of appearance of people through deeds and words. From this follows the requirement: seclusion cannot remain a closed secret if it claims political or social significance. Preparation gains meaning only with the intention of making itself useful in the common context. Practices of forming oneself as preparation for action are techniques of self-transformation. Michel Foucault considered practices of the self as methodical devices that transform subjectivity. In this key, seclusion becomes a form of technology. Disciplines of thought, regimes of attention, and specificities of recording results. Each such technique requires testing against reality, otherwise it will remain an internal toy. The boundaries of the method should be defined clearly. Seclusion ceases to be preparation if it serves avoidance of responsibility, if it strengthens fear of meeting the other, or if it substitutes action with mere reflection. Factors that undermine the transformation of secluded experience into public action are closed language, fear of criticism, and absence of communication channels. Recognizing these limits is not self-limitation, but a way to determine which practices need to be corrected.
What practical steps translate secluded work into public readiness? The first step is to fix results in a form suitable for exchange. Notes, short theses, questions for discussion. The second step is a regular check for comprehensibility. Can you explain your discovery to a person who did not live with you in the workshop? The third step is to create small public trials. A short text, a recorded talk, a discussion with one trusted person. These steps preserve the work in form and open the path to testing. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of the power of solitude as a condition of self-overcoming and creative discipline. His thought suggests that preparation must be linked to purposeful growth, not to retreat into comfort. Growth presupposes effort, and the effort must be aimed at making what was gained in silence ready for use in common affairs. The social and economic context imposes limitations on the possibility of such preparation. Seclusion is not equally accessible to everyone. Resources of time, privacy, safety affect the quality of the workshop. Recognizing these realities requires solidaristic solutions. If preparation for action is necessary for society, part of this work should be supported by institutions and practices of shared responsibility. A brief fixation for action. Treat seclusion as a laboratory where instruments are being tested. Make records that translate the internal into the public. Practice clarity of language. Test for comprehensibility and consequences. Preserve discipline, but test it in contact with the world. Language and action are bridges that turn solitude into public work. Make the workshop a resource, not a refuge. Practically, this means set deadlines for internal experiments. Record not only conclusions, but doubts. Prepare small versions of your ideas for testing. Invite people who know how to ask critical questions. Do not demand full agreement. Look for a clear reaction and specific questions. When criticism comes, treat it as a clarification of form, not as a threat to the person. That way, the craft weathers blows and becomes serviceable. Finally, keep time in mind. The workshop and the public square require different rhythms. In the workshop, you can slow down. In the public sphere, you must respond promptly. Balance preparation and engagement. Without regular checking, even the best idea loses force. The ability to move from solitude to action is a skill that can be developed methodically. Start small and keep the general usefulness in view. Stay connected with communities and share methods. Demand time, access, and training from organizations for those who are preparing. Create common spaces for trial and error. If the workshop becomes a network where solitude serves the common cause and action is the fruit of work. Solitude serves as a method of discovering truth where social confirmations are unavailable. Such a method presupposes systematic work with one's own testimony, turning internal impressions into a procedure of verification and consciously accepting the risk of being wrong without immediate external support. This works through several interrelated techniques. First, a thought is formulated as a hypothesis and fixed in language, usually in writing. Then, it is simplified so that separate components can be tested. Next,
thought experiments are run and contradictions searched for.
One person, along with the problem, writes down assumptions, then discards the superfluous, and runs the situation through different scenarios, as if through a laboratory experiment in the mind. Such a practical algorithm makes inner intuition visible and open to criticism, turning an intuitive claim into a set of testable theses. This technique requires discipline and specific tools. Observation journals, argumentation tables, formulations of simplified questions, and sequential verification steps limit sprawling reflection and provide concreteness. Regularity matters. Repeated exercises form the habit of separating a sense of truth from the grounds for confidence. In such work, the mind learns to distinguish robust connections from random coincidences and develops criteria for evaluating its own experience. The limits of the method are clear and felt. Working alone increases the likelihood of systematic errors. Personal prejudices become deeply rooted. The fear of admitting a mistake remains without an external catalyst, and language can become a mirror for repeating the same wrong moves. External checks do not replace internal honesty, but serve as a complementary mechanism and a protection against a self-confirming cycle. Thus, the method of solitude needs built-in safeguards: formal recording of argumentative steps, intentional simulation of counter-arguments, and plans to subject results to real-world testing. René Descartes proposed methodological doubt as a practice convenient to perform in solitude, and it is precisely the solitary recording of doubts that makes them clear. Søren Kierkegaard emphasized that the personal relation to truth requires choices a person makes alone, and solitude here becomes an exam of sincerity. René Descartes thought that systematic doubt reveals indestructible foundations of knowledge. So he spoke of a procedure of purifying the mind before building a system. Søren Kierkegaard stressed that the experience of truth has an existential character and is confirmed by personal decision, not by general consensus. The practical consequence for you is to turn solitary work into a method, not a state. Record thoughts step by step, formulate criteria for testing, model opposing arguments, and set deadlines for external review. Prepare small tests of ideas under real conditions and use the world's responses as the testing ground. Only in this way does solitude become a way of approaching truth rather than a room where mistakes can sit unpunished for years. Start small. Choose one problem and devote a series of short sessions to solitary analysis. Set time limits, no more than an hour at a stretch, and record conclusions in 3 lines: the hypothesis, the criterion for refutation, the next action. After a week, review the notes and check which assumptions held up and which required correction. Such cyclicity turns solitude into a process, not a passive state of reflection. When working on complex or emotionally charged topics, it is useful to separate levels of analysis. First, write facts and observations without interpretations. Then separately formulate emotions and motivations, and only then move to conclusions. This helps avoid conflating data with desires, which often leads to error. When facts are separated, it is easier to construct thought experiments and find weak spots in the argument. Another technique is to recruit artificial opponents. Create for and against arguments with equal rigor. Set yourself the task of defending the position you do not think correct, and lose it on paper. If the refutation is easily found, your initial judgment needs revision. If it is hard to resist, perhaps you should reconsider the criteria for admissible evidence. Demand clarity from yourself in expression. Use simple sentences. Avoid vague pronouns and general formulations. They mask weak spots. The record should be specific enough that a friend reading it could repeat your thought process and criticize it. Then the solitary method becomes a public tool ready for testing. Do not forget temporal distance. Sometimes the best test is to set an idea aside for several days or weeks and return to it with a different mood. Periodically refraining from immediate exchange of ideas reduces the pressure of social expectations and allows you to see which arguments are resilient to changing moods and circumstances. Gradual integration of external feedback is also important. Schedule concrete moments to demonstrate your conclusions to friends, colleagues, a mentor, and agree in advance on the format of criticism. Formats in which an opponent answers clear questions or tries to find counter-arguments work best, rather than general evaluations. Thus, an external perspective becomes a tool of strengthening rather than destruction. Emphasize the ethical component of the practice. Solitary verification can lead to decisive steps that affect other people. Therefore, carefully assess the consequences of your decisions and look for ways to compensate potential harm. Seek a balance between sincerity to yourself and responsibility to the world. Finally, watch for signs of pathological seclusion. If doubts turn into constant inhibition, if fear of error paralyzes action, or if records become a way to avoid contact altogether, reassess the method. In such cases, it is useful to bring in external help. Therapy. Solitude is often presented as a private island of thought, but here lies a problem. A solitary point of view easily loses the ability to imagine another as an internally autonomous subject. When the internal monologue becomes the main stage, other people's thoughts and feelings turn into a backdrop suitable for confirming one's own correctness. This leads to reduced living engagement in people's fates and to a habit of evaluating them through the prism of one's own experiences, rather than by attempting to stand in their place. The criterion by which one can judge whether solitude cultivates empathy is connected to the three-dimensional capacity of consciousness. First, to imagine another not as a set of roles and reactions, but as a world containing its own experience. Second, to hold simultaneously in the mind multiple perspectives and feel an emotional response to them. Third, to retain readiness for moral action without an external observer. These capacities show up in the language of thoughts, in the detail of imagination, in compassionate attention to motives, and in the willingness to admit that your intuition may be wrong regarding another's experience. How the internal test of such capacities is organized can be seen by how dialogue forms in the head. If thoughts are built as an exchange of voices, if your self-talk allows alternative interpretations, then solitude becomes a theater of opinions, where the other's position is presented in full. Mikhail Bakhtin spoke of the polyphony of voices as the condition of authentic dialogue. When voices multiply inside you, space for sympathy appears, because the other's voice is granted autonomy rather than serving only as a reflection of your expectations. The consequences of meeting these criteria affect both ethical and practical sides of life. Solitude that maintains attention to the other's subjectivity deepens the capacity for responsible action and makes relationships less dependent on utility and manipulation. Martin Buber reminded us that the encounter as I, thou requires respect for the face of the other. This encounter can begin from solitary reflection if that reflection has learned to listen. Søren Kierkegaard drew attention to personal choice as a moral act,
The choice will be honest when, in solitude, connection with others' sufferings and joys is preserved, not just one's own internal dramatics. If the mentioned capacities weaken, solitude produces a distorted moral distance. Imagination, deprived of dialogue, constructs schematic images of others that serve to justify indifference or moral self-righteousness. This creates a plateau of moral inertia where decisions are made by purely internal criteria that are not checked against the facts of others' needs and motives. Then the risk increases of acts that are formally correct but blind in substance, when actions play the role of self-confirmation rather than service. The boundary of the idea's applicability is clear and felt. Solitude fosters empathy only on the condition that the inner space remains porous to another's experience. Memory keeps contact with past faces. Language can describe subtle shades of feeling, and imagination has not degraded into clichés.
Martin Heidegger emphasized that human being is essentially related to the presence of others. Solitude works productively if it rests on this ontological with others, not on absolute detachment. Where socio-cultural experience has been erased, or where personal psyche has closed off due to trauma, solitude does not create empathy. It simply consolidates isolation. Another important limit concerns the ethics of responsibility. Empathy born in solitude does not absolve one from verification in real communication and from accounting for consequences to others. René Descartes drew attention to the clarity and transparency of thoughts as a condition of cognition. Similarly, empathy requires clear ideas about the other. Otherwise, it remains a beautiful illusion. Solitude gives space to create these representations, but it does not replace interaction as a way of verification and correction. One question remains practically oriented. Is your solitude ready to take in another's voice and hold it without reduction? Test your inner speech for the capacity to sustain alternatives and for the tendency to act in the interest of the person you imagine, even if no one will know of your act. If you learn this in silence, solitude becomes a school of sympathy, where attentive regard for others, not only for yourself, is formed. Practice starts small, a few minutes of patient imagination daily. Imagine another's actions, doubts, and joys. Do not hurry to judge, note the details. Then subject your images to doubt. What assumptions did you make? What facts might contradict them? Ask an internal voice to try on the other's point of view and describe how the feeling changes. Record these attempts, a letter to an imagined interlocutor, a dialogue with their I, notes on what was difficult to accept. Reading fiction is another method. Characters in a novel provide ready-made other monologues. By following them closely, learn to recognize motives and rationalizations. Notice how passion and fear shape actions. Immersion in literary consciousness expands the range of possible eyes and sharpens attention to subtle moral dilemmas. Film and theater work similarly, but add body and voice as sources of meaning. Facial expression, timbre, pause can reveal what dry notes do not capture. Finally, transfer exercises from the mind into deeds. Look for simple, real-world opportunities to help without expecting recognition. Support a neighbor. Listen to an acquaintance. Give up convenient rightness in favor of understanding. After acting, return to silence and analyze. What motives moved you? How well did you truly hear the other? Where did old projections reappear? Such a circle, imagination, testing, action, analysis, is the empathy trainer that makes solitude lively and socially useful. That circle, imagination, testing, action, analysis, turns solitude into a moral workshop. It remains a workplace where not self-justification,
but genuine care is formed. If you are ready to maintain this order, solitude will become a force multiplying the capacity to hear and respond. Let solitude not be a refuge from the world, but a preparatory ground for sincere encounters and responsible acts, vetted by attention to another's experience. The concluding thought is devoted to how solitude becomes preparation for life's end. The mechanism is simple and subtle. Solitude narrows the field of external roles and leaves you with your own moral account, with language capable of naming fear and duty, with memory demanding prioritization. In this silence, habits form that turn the abstract thought that everything will end into practical movements. Forgiveness, putting affairs in order, choosing what makes sense to leave behind. Solitude acts like a training hall for last words and final acts. There, the ability is tested to endure the view of the finitude of one's projects, to separate the important from the intermediate, to forego senseless compromises for the sake of the quality of the remaining life. Language plays a key role. The ability to speak honestly to oneself, to voice fears, to write addressed farewell letters, to organize one's possessions, to make a will. This is not bureaucracy. It is an act of care for those you will leave behind. Attention in solitude becomes a practice of presence, an ability to be ready for the fact that meaning is measured not by the number of deeds, but by depth of relationships and clarity of choice. Why this is needed? Preparing for death through solitude gives space for moral responsibility. Decisions made in silence are more often well thought out. You are accountable for motives, not only for the outward success of the act. Such practice reduces fear of the end because it ceases to be a surprise and becomes part of life's structure. Creativity acquires meaningful urgency. A project written with awareness of finitude tends toward honesty and simplicity of language. Relationships gain quality. Farewell, duty, request, and forgiveness become actions carried out in time, not postponed to an indefinite later. Where the mechanism breaks down, characteristic distortions arise. Solitude can turn into withdrawal, into a rigid rehearsal where preparation becomes an end in itself and life is immobilized by fear of the end. There may appear a tendency to aestheticize death or dramatize illness, when the tragic becomes a means of self-assertion. Closeness, isolation born of fear of losses, deprive the practice of external checks, and then moral decisions remain unconfirmed. Physical and legal constraints also set limits. No internal rituals substitute for the need for medical care, for arrangements agreed with relatives, for public institutions that formalize care and memory. The boundaries are clear and felt. Preparation is useful if it is connected to real contexts, if words written in silence come out through conversations and agreements. It is dangerous when it replaces interaction with people and systems that provide care. In the absence of social support or in pathological introspection, solitude leads to closure, to rigidity of desires, and to loss of the ability to entrust one's last will to others. Practice remains simple and accessible. Start small. Write a letter that can be read by loved ones. Think through what should remain after you. Agree on concrete steps with those who will be near. Perform rituals that help to conclude. Hold an evening of memories with those you love. Speak a farewell aloud. Review affairs and remove what hinders clarity. Train the ability to let go of petty ambitions for the sake of conscientiously finishing what matters. These simple actions
affect the quality of the last days and how you will live up to them. Assembling into a single picture ties the previous ideas together. Solitude, as a laboratory of thought, teaches that word and silence form the moral. Attention in solitude disciplines desires and creates boundaries that give the freedom to act. Rituals and memory provide stability and pass care on. The ability to hold another's perspective makes final decisions attentive to those who remain. Preparation for the end is the cultivation of maturity, when life and its completion are connected by a unified set of practices and meanings. If you are ready to accept finitude as a task, solitude will become a place where courage, clarity, and goodwill are developed. A brief summary of the thoughts. Solitude allows you to make an honest accounting of your life. It trains attention and language for final decisions. Rituals and practices translate abstract fear into concrete actions. Interaction with others remains a necessary limiter and source of verification. Preparation for the end is an expression of maturity and responsibility. Good night.